Thanks, John, for saying yes to participate in this interview about leadership and communication.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I know that you've been working in many different fields and mostly about philosophy and communication philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But maybe we could tune in and or zoom in and talk more about leadership in this little conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've heard you talk a lot about flux and movement, fluidity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And when we're talking about organizations, how can we use this way of thinking when we think upon organizations?
Well, I guess one of the main themes is trying. There's an ex-friend of mine, I say ex, it's like the Monty Python ex-parrot, who's dead now, unfortunately. But he started talking about the difference between upstream thinking and downstream thinking.
Yeah. Was it Bortoft?
Well, only Bortoft.
Yeah.
And we tend very easily to talk in terms of entities that have already been well formed, so to speak. All of our Western languages are noun and thing languages. And we're not very good at thinking of things that are still in process, still in the flow, still in the course of coming into being, and what the initial processes are like, where the stuff that ultimately is going to gather into a nameable something starts off in little bits and pieces all over the place.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So when we talk about downstream thinking and upstream thinking, how can leaders use this way of thinking in the organizational life?
Well, it's. I think one of the. I like the way in which David Cooperide and Silvestre started their whole way of working in the Cleveland Clinic, and they simply said, we believe there's a lot of potential in the clinic. What do you think the potential is in your part of the organisation? And all of a sudden, everybody had a little bit to offer, very different bits in the different parts of the organisation. I think they put all of these bits into a newsletter, I seem to remember. It was the Cleveland Clinic. I got drawn into the organisational field a little bit by accident. I'd written that Conversational Realities book in 1993, but there was a guy he was actually Norwegian, but he was head of the Swedish Work Institute, Arbetsinstitutet, and he was working with Stephen Tolmin, who had been very influenced by Wittgenstein. Bjorn Gustafsson was his name, and Bjorn had a very similar notion that quite big changes could be done by all kinds of small changes here, there and everywhere. And his student, Øyvind Palshaugen, did a study in the Oslo cigar factory, and I do remember a couple of little details. One was a person saying, oh, I've got to carry this tray along this narrow corridor with a sharp bend, so I've got to put it down and take it up in another direction to get it round the bend. If only the bend was rounded off, I wouldn't have to put it down. And another one was saying, this machine has got rather a small wheel and it goes in jerks. If there's a bigger wheel, I could work it much more smoothly, and so on. So being prepared to listen to the voice of the people on the front line with all the small... Most people want to do a good job. But like to make things in their work easier for themselves on the one hand, and turn out a better job on the other. And so listening to the voices of the people on the front line.
Yeah. But it can sometimes be difficult if there is a big distance between the leader and the employees.
Yes.
So how can the leader work on these issues to get closer to the employees?
Well, for a start, being prepared to walk around, put themselves down on the ground of if it's a factory, walk the workshop floor. One thing that happened to me, I actually first left school at 15 to work in an aircraft factory. And the works manager was up on a mezzanine floor, and he walked up and down, shouting down from it. And there was one little incident where the tea trolley was coming down from one set of workbenches to another. And he shouted out, "Get back, you pigs! Only leave your benches when the tea trolley arrives." It's a way of making people full of anger and resentment. And just shouting at them as if they're all idiots. Well, you heard me in my presentation perhaps saying it's not that people get upset in their work for not being paid enough, that they do quite often. Sometimes they're cut right back to the bone. There's something called 0 hours contracts in England at the moment. But in the days of dock workers, everybody used to have to turn up at the gate and the foreman say, "I'll have you, you and you. The rest of you I don't want today." Most people don't like the work situation because they feel continually humiliated and held in contempt. And not taken any notice of.
Do you see that the companies are changing? Because
no, I think they're getting worse.
It's getting worse?
I think it's getting really worse.
Do you talk about both the public sector and the private sector? Is it the same tendency you see, or are there some differences?
I think another crazy thing that's happening in organisation is this urge for super efficiency. I had a student years ago write me an essay on the anorexic organisation, and it's exactly that. There's a marvellous essay by Albert Hirschman. I think it's a 1959 essay. It's called Exit, Voice and Loyalty. But the first chapter in that book is about the need for what you might call a bit of slack. You know, it's the American expression when we're talking, "Oh, give me a bit of slack here. I may not get it quite right first time." There's no room for getting things wrong first time, or having a few excess people not working very hard. As soon as a crisis comes along, let me just turn this off. As soon as a crisis comes along, all of a sudden you're in a mess. You have to hire, my wife's working in the whole mental health industry. She's from Trinidad, and this is a little bit of a diversion, but she just had an awful few years in the healthcare trust because we discover the rural areas in Cambridge are still totally racist.
Mm.
So she's gone to work in a private healthcare company. But she finds there that this anorexic way of organising means that any small crisis, any little thing that takes people by surprise, she's got to bring in bank nurses.
Oh.
And if you work out the cost, it's crazy. They're saving money in one way and then spending it in other way. And it's, I don't know, it seems to be a continual process of crisis management.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would be the great alternative if we could do magic? How then could we work with organizations and leadership?
Somehow having conversations which take into account the larger context within which the organisation is working. So many organisations seem to me to they find a marvellous way of working for a while. We found one single right way, and then the world changes and the organisations fossilise, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
And they go under. They've got no flexibility for working with changed conditions.
Yeah. So how can we create organizations that are flexible and alive and not get too stiff?
Well, you know, Jakob Storch and I have done this article taking up Winnicott's notion of a good enough mother. We have this notion, and of course it comes all the way from mathematics, all the way from the Greeks really, that there's always an ideal somewhere. There's always a perfection. And of course this was driving some mothers crazy. Oh, I'm a failure as a mother, I'm not perfect, and so forth. And Winnicott, to alleviate some of this maternal stress, came up with this notion of a good enough mother. And Jakob and I were thinking about, in fact, without knowing that good enough phrase, one of his fairly senior managers came up with the phrase of an imperfect, a non-perfect manager. And of course one of the things that was central to Jakob's whole way of running his organisation was being enormously collaborative.
Yeah, for sure.
Having a lot of his fairly senior managers continually collaborating with him, and himself sitting in on various, not letting himself get divorced from the actual, if you could say, the front line of what the organisation was all about.